Okay, now we're on the tail end of the period needed for your essay. This is the 1820s, and there are only two major events left to cover. Those are the Cato Street Conspiracy of 1820 and the Queen Caroline Affair of 1820 to 1821, and the economic recovery is self-explanatory. So I've included a painting of Queen Caroline there in the middle, and the famous painting of the Bow Street runners arresting the Cato Street conspirators in their house in Cato Street. So, onto the Cato Street conspiracy. The conspiracy was organised by Spenceans, whom had been involved with the Sparfields meetings of 1816. The main one of these was Arthur Thistlewood, but there are also some interesting figures that partook in the conspiracy, such as a man called James Davidson, who had grown up in the Caribbean, I believe, and he had come to England on his parents' bursary money. One of his grandparents actually partly related to Arthur Thistlewood, but I digress. So the conspiracy took place in February of 1820. It was one of the most revolutionary events of the period, and once again the government had a spy on the inside, and his name was George Edwards, and there's a hot debate among historians as to whether or not he acted as an agent provocateur, which essentially means he egged on the conspirators and got them to engage in more extreme and violent measures as a means to justify a government clampdown on the liberties enjoyed by the reformers. So thinking about Lord Liverpool's 6 acts there. So the Spenceans essentially planned to assassinate Lord Liverpool's entire cabinet while they attended a dinner party at Lord Harrowby's house in Grosvenor Square on February 22nd. The Spenceans hoped that while the chain of command was paralysed from the top down due to the assassination of the government, the ensuing chaos would allow for simultaneous uprisings throughout the country and the inevitable overthrow of the government. Now, obviously, this did not happen and they failed. This is because Edwards knew about the plot from its inception, and the men were swiftly arrested by the Bow Street runners in Cato Street. Following this, the leaders were executed for high treason, as you can see on the picture to the right there. I believe that's a replica of a May Day celebration, but obviously the 5 main conspirators, James Davison you can see there, and Arthur Thistlewood at the top. So the leaders were executed and 5 other participants were shipped away to, I believe, Australia. I know one of them was sent to Botany Bay, and I believe one of them actually became a mayor while he was deported, so obviously he was interested in politics, but he's going to be engaging in such revolutionary activities. Just interesting to note. So, did the government handle the Cato Street conspiracy well? Once again, we can see their use of spies kept them well informed, and it essentially castrated the movement before they could really do anything. So if they're well informed, it's easy to suppress an attempted assassination, so they dealt with it very well in that way. But as I have previously mentioned, the government suppression and curtailing of freedom of speech could be partially blamed for these violent activities, because remember, prior to Peterloo, where Hunt was discouraging the petitioning of Parliament, many of the radicals and reformers were doing these legal means to try and effect reform by petitioning Parliament, and it was only because the government kept refusing these petitions that Hunt ultimately said, right, we've had enough of this now, it's time for deeds, not words, as Emmeline Pankhurst would have said. So, now we're moving on to the Queen Caroline affair. The Queen Caroline affair was the only threat taken up by reformers, both radical and moderate, that originated from within the government itself. So essentially you have to think all the other things occurred due to outside pressure. So poverty, ideology, the Napoleonic Wars, Protestantism in the case of the Gordon riots, but this came from within the government itself. And this was a thing that would be taken up by politicians during the reform crisis. So you have to think about using the public pressure to pressure the opposition. So the Whigs, although they did not incite any of the stuff like the May Day riots, the Bristol riots, the Days of May, they can partially be considered the government and active politicians spurning on this kind of radical activity. So, the affair demonstrated that the populace could be mobilised into action through political excitement generated by those holding high office. So, as I just said, evident in the reform crisis. Queen Caroline was essentially wed to George IV before he ascended to the throne, but they separated shortly after their marriage. Then, following her husband's ascendancy, she demanded to be granted the title of Queen, and obviously the government could not have this, as it would make a mockery of such an ancient institution. So, how did the government attempt to solve this problem? The government offered her money to leave, and although Caroline initially declined, after she refused to enter George's coronation, she inevitably took the pension of £50,000, and she was ready to leave and go off her own way, leaving the affairs of the government. But unfortunately, shortly after the affair, she took ill and died on August 6th, 1821, just a month after the pension had been offered to her. There is a funny story about her attending the coronation, though, so it's not all doom and gloom for this part. It's funny because she tried to get into the actual place where the ceremony was taking place, and she was turned away at the door, so it's just an interesting thing to think about for the time. Essentially royal being turned away. I imagine the Germans wouldn't have been too happy about that, but... So at her funeral, there was a minor demonstration by reformers, but it was nothing serious, and essentially it just marked the end of popular protest in the period until we get on to the next part of the reform crisis of the early 1830s, which I previously alluded to. So, why did the reform movement essentially hit a lull at this point, and why did popular protest die down? Well, it was largely due to economic recovery, because obviously if economic recovery is caused a massive subsidence in popular protest, maybe you can write about in your essay that much of it, although there were political and ideological aspects to motivate the protests, you could argue that the people were only motivated to engage in them by the impoverishment they suffered due to a failing economy, which essentially was just the economy in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars and the post-war recession, which is a widely demonstrated effect. And I believe there's another quote that you may be able to use in your essay. I wouldn't recommend it because it's not contemporary, but I believe Vladimir Lenin said a country is only ever 3 meals away from revolution. So that's something to consider. Were the populace starving and that's why they participated in much of the popular protest, or was it due to them having ideologically driven ideas and motives behind their actions? That's up for you to decide. So that's the end of our series that covers popular protest between 1780 and 1820. Thank you.